Her face is one of the most recognizable in the history of art, the angelic child at the center of Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas, a symbol of purity, innocence, and the golden age of Spain. But what if I told you that image is nothing but a beautiful lie? That behind the walls of a glittering palace, a tragedy unfolded so chilling that it still sends shivers down the spine. This is the story of how the most desired princess in Europe was born only to become a victim. In this video, we will uncover the darkest secrets of the Habsburg dynasty. We will reveal why the very blood her family fought so desperately to keep pure turned into her greatest curse, slowly killing her from within. You will see how the body of a young girl was forced into becoming a relentless machine for producing heirs, and how that machine broke down by the age of 21. And we will show the shocking, desperate act she committed in an attempt to save her children, an act that placed the blame for her suffering on an entire people. This is not a story about the glitter of the crown. It is a story about its terrible price. Stay with us until the end to discover how the world's most famous infanta became a hostage to her dynasty, and why her tragic death marked the beginning of the end for one of history's greatest empires. Vienna, 1673. In the suffocating chambers of the Hofburg Palace, the light is fading. Heavy velvet curtains shut out the weak daylight, and the air is thick with the smell of melting wax, incense, and bitter medicine. In the center of the room, on a massive canopy bed, life is slipping away. Empress Margarita Teresa of Spain is just 21, yet her body, exhausted by 6 pregnancies in 6 short years of marriage, can bear no more. At her side stands her grieving husband, Emperor Leopold I, powerless. The court physicians, the finest minds in Europe, have already given up. On the pale, almost transparent face of the young woman, there is no trace of the angelic beauty that Velázquez immortalized only a few years earlier. On the canvas of Las Meninas, she was the radiant 5-year-old infanta, the shining center of a universe, the symbol of purity and hope for a great dynasty. Now, on her deathbed, she is its tragic sacrifice. How did it come to this? How did the little girl adored by her father, King Philip IV of Spain, his alegría, his joy, end up at such a dreadful end? This is the story of a princess born to strengthen an empire, yet offered up on the altar of its ambitions. A candle that burned too quickly, but whose light still exposes the frightening truth hidden behind centuries of glory. Her story begins in Madrid, in the Royal Alcázar in 1651. Her birth was not just a family joy, but an act of state, calculated and deliberate. The Spanish Habsburg Empire, the greatest power of the age, was desperate for heirs. The arrival of Infanta Margarita Teresa was another move in a cold dynastic game. She entered a world with no place for childish freedom. Instead, she was surrounded by strict court etiquette, suffocating religiosity, and a constant, heavy fear for the dynasty's future. Her father was King Philip IV, her mother, his own niece, Mariana of Austria. From her first breath, Margaret was not just a child, but a precious asset of the crown, the living embodiment of her family's hopes and ambitions. Philip, weary from the burdens of rule and the grief of countless losses, loved her dearly.
In letters and diary entries, he called her mi alegría, my joy. Her laughter was a rare ray of light in the dark, echoing halls of the palace, a comfort to the aging king. But even that affection was tied to politics. A healthy, beautiful, and intelligent girl was not only a beloved daughter, but the last hope for the survival of a fading dynasty. That hope shone even brighter in contrast with her younger brother, Infante Charles, the future Charles II. From his earliest years, his many physical and mental afflictions, the result of centuries of inbreeding, were obvious. Weak, sickly, and disfigured, he was a living reminder of the curse within the purest Habsburg blood. Margaret, by contrast, seemed the picture of health and vitality. She was the shining pearl in the gilded cage of the Spanish court, a vessel destined to preserve and carry forward the dynasty's legacy. And so her fate was sealed, long before she could understand it. From her earliest years, her life had a single purpose: marriage. Every part of her upbringing was carefully designed to prepare this living treasure for her predestined role. In 1656, at just 5 years old, her image was immortalized in one of the greatest masterpieces of world art. In the sunlit studio of court painter Diego Velázquez, a scene unfolded that would be frozen forever on the canvas of Las Meninas. At the very center of the complex composition stands the little infanta. Dressed in a voluminous silver-white gown, she shines like a porcelain figurine, radiating an almost unearthly glow. Around her stand ladies-in-waiting, court dwarfs, a great dog, even the artist himself at his easel. But every gaze, every line of the composition converges on her, on this fragile child. This painting was far more than just a court portrait. It was a carefully calculated political statement. At a time when her brother, the heir to the throne, was already showing troubling signs of poor health, her radiant image was meant to send a message across Europe, and especially within Spain itself. The Habsburg dynasty still had a future. She was the embodiment of purity, stability, and legitimacy. Velázquez captured that truth with genius. She was always in the spotlight, yet her own voice meant nothing. Her wishes, her thoughts, her childhood dreams, all were irrelevant. What mattered was her status and the role she was destined to play. Her entire education was designed with that single goal in mind. From the earliest age, she studied foreign languages, music, dance, and the complexities of court etiquette. She was trained in the Catholic faith, not so much for her soul's salvation, but to embody the image of a pious ruler. Every day was scheduled to the minute. Every lesson another step in shaping her into the perfect bride for a future emperor. This was not preparation for life. It was conditioning for duty. Velázquez's genius lay in his ability to capture this paradox. On the canvas, we see a charming, lively child, but beneath her glow, we sense the crushing weight of fate resting on her small shoulders. That dazzling image hid absolute predestination and a complete absence of choice. Behind the splendor of the Spanish court and the brilliance of the artist lay a dark secret, one that would define her entire life. A secret flowing in her very blood.
Behind the glittering facade of power, the gold and purple, the vast lands over which the sun never set, was the Habsburgs' greatest obsession: the purity of blood. For centuries they believed their divine right to rule could only be preserved in one way: by keeping outsiders out. What began as a belief hardened into ruthless political strategy. Generation after generation, the Habsburgs married within their own family. Uncles wed nieces, cousins wed cousins. Each union pulled the genetic knot tighter. The aim seemed noble and practical: to keep Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and the New World united under one crown, without dividing the empire among Europe's royal houses. But this strategy had a terrible price. What the Habsburgs thought was their greatest strength became their most fatal weakness. Along with power, they also concentrated genetic defects, passed down relentlessly through their bloodline. The family tree of Margaret Teresa resembled a tangled web where the same ancestors reappeared again and again as grandfathers, great-grandfathers, uncles. Her very parents were the starkest example. Her mother, Mariana, was the daughter of her father Philip IV's own sister. That made Philip not only her husband, but also her uncle. And even that was not the limit. Margaret's future husband, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, was both her maternal uncle and her cousin. Pure blood had turned to degeneration, producing weak, sickly heirs who rarely survived into adulthood. Margaret, who in childhood seemed healthy and full of life, was only a temporary exception to this dreadful rule. She carried the same time bomb in her blood, and her mission, to give birth to a healthy heir, was almost impossible. But in the mid-17th century, no one understood genetics. Misfortunes were blamed on divine wrath or cruel fate. And so, when she turned 12, her destiny was sealed with signatures on a marriage contract. She was officially betrothed to her Austrian relative, Leopold. Childhood was over. It was time to leave home and prepare for duty. In 1666, at just 14, the hour of farewell arrived. That day split her life into before and after. All of Madrid turned out to say goodbye to their infanta. A glittering procession wound through the streets of the capital. But behind the splendor of carriages and livery, a quiet personal tragedy was unfolding. She was not only leaving her city and her palace, she was leaving behind everything she knew and loved. Her devoted father, for whom she had been his joy. Her frail younger brother, her ladies-in-waiting, the familiar rhythms of her childhood life. In the rooms of the Alcázar, she left behind her dolls and toys, silent witnesses to a childhood that would never return. From Spanish infanta, she was to become the future empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Her journey stretched across the whole of Europe and lasted for months. It was not a trip, but a staged political performance. The bridal procession, dozens of carriages, hundreds of riders and servants, was meant to display the wealth and power of the Spanish crown. In every city along the way, grand receptions were held, cannons fired, solemn masses celebrated. Margaret was welcomed as a future sovereign, showered with praise and costly gifts. She was the glittering centerpiece of this masquerade, its living jewel. But behind the official smiles and flawless etiquette was the heart of a frightened, lonely teenage girl. Night after night, in traveling tents or foreign palaces, she was left alone with her fears. Ahead lay an unfamiliar country with a strange language and alien customs, and a husband, Leopold, the emperor, twice her age,
a man she barely knew. Each turn of the carriage wheels carried her farther from home, closer to a terrifying unknown. This long journey was not only a passage through space, but a painful transformation within. From child to woman, from a father's beloved joy to a tool of statecraft. At last, after the exhausting road, her procession reached Vienna. The city greeted her with ringing bells, music, and the lights of endless balls and operas. But could this brilliant foreign court ever become her true home? Vienna welcomed Margaret with a dazzling cascade of festivities. The entire city seemed to transform into a stage with a never-ending performance in her honor. Balls gave way to masquerades, opera premieres to lavish hunts. But all this splendor only deepened her inner loneliness. She quickly realized there was an unbridgeable gulf between the strict, almost monastic discipline of the Spanish court and the freer, more worldly life of Vienna. Here, wit, light conversation, and social intrigue were prized. She had been raised instead in silence, solemn dignity, and strict religiosity. She felt like a stranger, a curious, exotic creature put on display. Unable or unwilling to accept the new rules of the game, Margaret instinctively tried to recreate a little island of Spain around her. She continued to wear strict Spanish gowns, spoke only in Spanish, and surrounded herself with Spanish ladies-in-waiting and confessors. At first, this stubborn refusal to assimilate caused confusion, then growing irritation among the Austrian nobility. Her behavior was taken for arrogance, her reserve as disdain for her new homeland. She became empress, but she never became one of them. The only person who showed her real warmth was her husband, Emperor Leopold. Despite the age difference and the cold political calculation behind their union, the two developed surprisingly tender, almost familial affection. He called her gently Gretel. She, out of habit, still addressed him as uncle. They bonded over their shared love of music, theater, and art. Leopold often included her in court performances, where for a brief moment she could forget her role and feel like a young girl again. But this fragile idyll was only a facade. Behind it loomed her single, overwhelming duty. Their marriage was not a union of hearts, but a dynastic contract. Its central clause was simple: the birth of male heirs to continue the Austrian Habsburg line. As soon as Margaret turned 16, the entire court, the whole empire, held its breath. The pressure was crushing. Her life was no longer ruled by etiquette, but by biology. Her body was no longer her own. It was now a resource of the state. The hopes of the dynasty rested on the shoulders of a girl barely 16. But fate had already prepared her first cruel blow. When news spread through Vienna that the young empress was expecting, it seemed the empire itself prayed in unison. The dynasty's hopes, the court's ambitions, the future of the state, all concentrated in her fragile body. The pregnancy was hard, but Margaret endured with the stoicism instilled in her from the cradle. Finally, the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral rang out with joy. She had delivered an heir, a boy named Ferdinand Wenceslas. The celebrations were boundless. Leopold stayed close to the cradle, the court rejoiced, and across the land churches held masses of thanksgiving. It seemed Margaret had fulfilled her mission with brilliance. But the joy was short-lived. Only months later, the infant, frail from the start, began to fade. The best doctors in the empire were helpless. The fragile life that carried so many hopes slipped away, leaving a deafening silence in the palace halls. For Margaret, it was the first and cruelest blow of fate. She had encountered the merciless force that would haunt her until the end. Her grief was immeasurable, but duty demanded she try again. No sooner had she mourned than she was once more with child. Her body, not yet fully grown, was forced into an exhausting race for the dynasty's survival. Her second child, mercifully, was stronger, a girl named Maria Antonia. Her birth brought comfort, but not a solution. The empire still needed a male heir. And so the machinery of motherhood ground on. Margaret's life became an unrelenting cycle: pregnancy, fleeting hope, painful labor, and, more often than not, mourning. One after another, children were born only to die within days, weeks, or months. Each loss was a fresh wound, draining not only her spirit, but her health. With every pregnancy, her strength ebbed. The radiant young infanta once painted by Velázquez was gone, replaced by a pale, frail woman. Court doctors noted her porcelain pallor, her constant weakness, her frequent illnesses. She withdrew from court festivities, spending most days confined to her chambers, often in bed. Her world shrank to her bedroom and the palace chapel, where she spent hours in desperate prayer. What had once been cultural isolation was now the expression of deep depression. Along with physical collapse came a break in her spirit. Raised in strict religiosity, Margaret could not accept her tragedies as mere chance. In her grief-stricken, superstitious mind, such suffering could only be punishment from God. But for what? That tormenting question haunted her day and night. She searched for a cause, a reason for the curse she believed hung over her and her children. In the depths of her despair, she began to find an answer. Her personal tragedy demanded someone to blame. And soon the anger, born of her maternal grief, would fall on an entire people. Lost in the labyrinth of her sorrow, where each day brought nothing but the shadow of yesterday's loss, her mind clutched desperately at an explanation. She could no longer believe it was all blind fate. There had to be something behind it, a curse, a malignant force she might identify, perhaps even drive away. And then, in her grief and in the dark prejudice of the 17th century, her suspicions took a monstrous shape. In that age, whenever disaster struck, harvest failure, plague, or personal tragedy, there was always one convenient, time-tested scapegoat. Her tear-blurred, faith-driven gaze fell upon Vienna's Jewish community.
She embraced this belief with all the force of her broken soul. She became convinced that the presence of infidels in the capital of a Christian empire had brought down God's wrath on her family, poisoning her very ability to give life. That thought became an obsession, the only explanation that made sense to her. From a grieving recluse, she turned into a zealous champion of faith. In her chambers, in the rare moments when Leopold came to see her, she no longer wept, she demanded. Pale, feverish, her eyes burning, she pleaded and commanded her husband to cleanse the city. She spoke of divine signs, of the need for sacrifice, for the dynasty's future, and for the souls of their lost children. Leopold was torn between his genuine love for his suffering wife, his own deep religious convictions, and cold political pragmatism. The Jewish community was a major economic force, and their expulsion would wound the treasury.
But reason paled against the daily sight of his Gretel's anguish. Her grief was his grief, and her unshakable belief in the cause of their misfortunes gradually became his own. At last he gave in. In 1670, the imperial decree was signed. Thousands of people, whose families had lived in Vienna for generations, were forced overnight to abandon their homes and possessions. Their synagogue was demolished, and in its place a Catholic church was laid as a symbol of victory. The quarter where they had lived was renamed Leopoldstadt, after the emperor who had cleansed the city. Margaret saw this as her greatest triumph, an act of redemption that would finally lift the curse. But the heavens stayed silent. The cruel sacrifice was made, and nothing changed. Soon she was pregnant again, and this time the ordeal was worse than ever. Her health, ravaged by endless pregnancies and unrelenting grief, now collapsed before everyone's eyes. The last spark of hope that had driven her to fight flickered out. She had committed a terrible act, believing it would save her. But the curse, if it existed at all, was not in the city's walls. It was in her own blood, the legacy of the Habsburgs she had been born to carry on. Realizing this was her final crushing blow. Her body, pushed beyond all limits, gave way at last, and fate prepared her for one final trial she could not survive. And so we return to Vienna in 1673, in those same dim chambers, heavy with incense and despair. Her last pregnancy, the fourth in less than 7 years of marriage, finally broke her ruined body. She barely clung to life, fading before the eyes of the court. When the end came, she was just 21. Her passing was quiet and agonizing, and with her died the unborn child, the last futile sacrifice on the altar of the dynasty. Leopold, her husband and uncle, was inconsolable. He wept for his Gretel, the child bride whose life he had seen consumed in the furnace of imperial duty. But the emperor's grief, however real, could not stop the relentless machinery of power. The dynasty needed an heir, and within months the widowed Leopold stood at the altar with a new bride. The Habsburg machine rolled on, stepping over the short, tragic life of the Spanish infanta. Her only surviving spark of hope was her daughter, Maria Antonia. Married into Bavaria, she bore a son, Joseph Ferdinand. Many saw him as a potential heir to the vast Spanish Empire, ruled by his childless uncle, the sickly Charles II. But the Habsburg curse seemed to pursue Margaret's descendants as well. At just 6 years old, the boy died suddenly. With his death, the last thread linking Margaret to the future was cut forever. Her line ended. Her death was not only a personal tragedy. It was a dark omen for the collapse of the entire Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. Only a few years later, her brother Charles II, the bewitched king, living proof of centuries of inbreeding, also died, leaving no heir. His death plunged Europe into the bloody war of the Spanish succession. The grand Habsburg dream of eternal power, which they had tried to secure through endless family unions, became its own undoing. The intricate web of marriages meant to preserve the empire had, in the end, destroyed it. The life of Margaret Teresa, sacrificed to save a dynasty, proved utterly in vain. Today, the name of Empress Margaret Teresa is nearly erased from history books. Her political role was brief and insignificant, but she lives on and will live forever in art. In Madrid's Prado Museum, millions of visitors every year stand before Velázquez's masterpiece Las Meninas. They see, at the canvas's heart, a radiant little girl in a shimmering dress, the very image of innocence and purity. They admire the painter's genius, the play of light, the elegance of the scene. But now we know the deeper, darker story hidden behind that angelic face. Her story is not just the biography of a forgotten empress. It is a piercing reminder of the terrible price demanded by royal ambition. She was born to serve an empire, but the empire took everything from her. Remembering her, we honor not the dynasty she served, but the little girl she once was. Her candle burned too quickly, but her light still shines across the centuries, illuminating the grim truth long hidden behind gilded frames and painted smiles.